In 1992, Alabama farmers were shocked to find their livestock mysteriously mutilated, void of evidence. To this day, we still don't have a satisfactory explanation for the events, but now it's a nationwide issue. This is Candace, and I'll be your guide. In fall 1992, in the Sand Mountain region of Alabama, farmers began reporting a bizarre string of livestock mutilations. The mutilations typically occurred in cattle, but sometimes in sheep and horses too. Cattle would be discovered with organs and/or body parts removed with near surgical precision. The animals often had been exsanguinated, meaning all of the blood had been removed from their bodies. Remarkably, no blood was found on the animals or on the ground beneath them. There's also no evidence of a struggle from the animals. The incisions always looked to be cauterized with high heat, searing blood vessels closed. There is never a clear cause of death aside from the organ loss. Although being void of blood, there's no evidence the animals suffered cardiac collapse. The body parts and organs taken varied per instance, but investigators feel confident there was no monetary value involved with the parts taken, so it's unlikely they were taken to be sold. Quite often, black helicopters were seen or heard flying low over the areas of the mutilations, either soon before or at the approximate time of. This story really is best began by the official press release from the Fife, Alabama PD on April 7, 1993. And y'all, this is a little bit long, but it's not boring and it really just tells the entire story. So I'm going to read the whole thing to you. These are the words of Charles Jr. Garmany. Quote, beginning in November of 1992, the Fife Police Department has been conducting an investigation into unexplained cattle mutilations in cooperation with neighboring police and law enforcement agencies. These reported incidents began on October 20th, 1992, and have continued through the last week in Marshall and DeKalb counties. To date, over 30 animals have been discovered dead in pastures, with various internal and external organs missing. The incisions examined on their animals exhibit a precise surgical cutting. In many of the cases, there has been evidence of extremely high heat at the tissue excisions. The absence of physical evidence adds to the mystery at the majority of mutilation sites. Though many animals have been found in soft pasture land, and in many cases in mud, there have been no footprints, tracks, or marks found anywhere near the mutilated animals. To date, no police agency has established a suspect or motive for these incidents of phantom surgery perpetrated on area livestock. Neither has an eyewitness or informant come forward to offer any credible insight or testimony. The first documented incident of cattle mutilation was reported on October 20th, 1992, by Albertville cattle farmer John Strawn. The animal was discovered in a wooded area of Mr. Strawn's pasture by a neighbor who found the animal dead, lying on its side. The animal's entire milk sac was missing, with no evidence of blood on the animal nor on the ground where it lay. The neighbor said the neat oval incision where the udder had been removed appeared to be charred. Other farmers in the Albertville area soon started reporting similar cases over the next 2 months. The same organs were reported missing, though what was taken varied from animal to animal. In many cases, the rectum had been cored out neatly, with no evidence of blood or body fluid present. On female livestock, the sex organs had been removed in an identical fashion, with clean, bloodless incisions. On male livestock, the sex organs had also been removed, again in oval, bloodless incisions. In early January, Albertville Police Department's Chief of Detectives, Tommy Cole, reported that his ranch too had fallen victim to the mutilators when a black Angus steer fell prey to the phantom surgeons. It was at that point that the Fife Police Department began working closely with the Albertville Police Department to further investigate the continuing incidents of mutilations. A week after Chief Detective Cole reported his steer, the mutilation struck again in Albertville. The next week, mutilated cattle were reported near Fife in Grove Oak. A week later, in Dawson, just outside of Fife. During the first week in February 1993, more than 9 cases of mutilations were discovered and reported in Marshall and DeKalb counties. Throughout all the cases, cattle farmers and their neighbors reported seeing or hearing helicopters in the vicinity, either before or shortly after mutilated cattle were discovered. Comparison to other cattle mutilations documented by law enforcement in 48 other states since 1963 shows that the cases recently documented here in Northeast Alabama are part of a national problem. In over 10,000 reported cases of livestock mutilations reported since 1967, the organs and tissue taken are always the same. Sex organs removed, tongue cut deep into the throat and removed. Individual eyes and ears, or sometimes both, have been excised. The jaw stripped to the bone and large oval cut, and all tissues cut clean. Rectums are cored out, almost like a stovepipe had been inserted and all the tissue and muscle had been pulled out. All of this has been accomplished on these thousands of animals with no evidence of blood present at the incision, and in some cases the entire blood supply of the animal had been drained, yet without cardiovascular collapse. Throughout the documented history of these cattle mutilations, no one has ever been charged or prosecuted with the crime. No one has ever been caught. Recently, many area residents and public officials have offered multiple causes and suspects that they believe may be responsible for these animals' wounds. Some say it's predator animals like coyotes or buzzards. Many people believe it's the work of a satanic cult or of college students. Newer evidence collected and analyzed by scientists of material collected from local animals and pastures clearly rules out both groups. On January 31st, 1993, a rancher in the Dawson community led investigators to the carcass of a black Angus cow. The animal's genitals and rectum had been cored out in one large incision that left a hole the size of a coffee can. The animal's jaw had been completely stripped in an oval incision that encompassed the entire right side of the animal's face. The tongue was completely gone, cut deep down into the throat. There was no blood present on the animal itself, nor on the ground surrounding it. Further examination revealed a flaky white material on the animal's right rib cage and on the ground 5 feet from the carcass. The material was placed in the empty wrapper of a cigarette pack and transported to the Fife PD, where it was transferred to a glass jar. While removing the flaky particles from the cigarette wrapper, the material came in contact with the brass tip of a ballpoint pen. Within 1 second of contact with the brass, the material melted into an almost clear liquid. To reduce the risk of this happening to the remaining material, the rest was shaken out into a jar where it remained unaffected. This white flaky material was then express shipped to a molecular biologist at a leading university for analysis. After 2 tests, the scientists determined that the substance was composed of aluminum, titanium, oxygen, and silicon in significant amounts. He stated that the amount of titanium was larger than he would ever expect to see in any substance, and that there was no way this combination of elements could ever occur in nature. This material has now been sent to another scientist for a second opinion. The second significant case in these incidents of livestock mutilations occurred on February 7, 1993, this time in Crossville, Alabama. Cattle farmer David McClendon noticed during his morning head count that he was missing a 3-week-old calf. He went searching for and found the animal in a wooded area, dead with a large portion of its right hind quarter missing. Examining the animal, Mr. McClendon found that all the calf's internal organs were missing, and all that he could see was the clean, empty chest cavity. There was no sign of blood on or near the animal. There were no teeth marks on the tissue, nor on the exposed leg bones. David McClendon called local and county law enforcement. Shortly after they arrived, the county deputy stated that the animal had been killed by predators and left. Mr. McClendon wasn't satisfied that this is what happened to his animal, and later that day he brought the calf to the Fife PD for a second opinion. A first look at the calf gave the impression that the animal had been eaten by wild animals. But a closer look revealed something else. According to investigating officer Ted Oliphant, the entire edge of the animal's wounds were straight and even. There was no evidence of tearing, ripping, or chewing anywhere. Below the right leg joint, the hide had been cut in a square with 2 right angle incisions. Close examination showed that the actual incision appeared to be serrated, almost like steps and notches at each base. During the initial examination of the calf, 6 tissue samples were taken from the animal and preserved in mason jars. These tissue samples were sent to Dr. John Altschuler, formerly of the University of Colorado, who now runs his own state-of-the-art pathology and hematology laboratory. Dr. Altschuler states that all 6 tissue samples he examined from David McClendon's calf had been exposed to high heat. The tissue had been cooked. Dr. Altschuler said the temperature required to do this would have to be in the hundreds of degrees and possibly higher to burn the tissue in this manner. As for the stepped and notched incisions, Dr. Altschuler stated that since he examined the first animal back in 1967, he has seen this type of cut over and over again in these mutilations. With these 2 lab reports of 2 different samples in 2 separate cases, we're forced to conclude that the predator animals cannot be blamed for the majority of the mutilation cases documented. Dr. Jim Armstrong, Auburn professor of zoology and wildlife science, concurs. He states, "It would be obvious if a coyote had been tearing through. The wounds would not be similar to a smooth cut. Coyotes bite through and pull to tear away the flesh. It would have a chewed-on look. There are other scavenger animals, such as vultures, that will eat at the softer regions of a cow, but there's not going to be these clean, surgical-type cuts. There is no way a coyote or other predator inflicted those wounds." In the past week, Dr. Armstrong has examined dozens of photographs of mutilated cows taken by the Fife Police Department. He states, "I went over the pictures with a USDA expert along with several wildlife biologists. With the exception of one individual, we all agreed that many of the cases were not typical predatory damage. The caution here is that we're dealing with photos, that there is no other physical evidence for us to look at. But the USDA agent and most others agreed with my conclusion that many of the pictures were not coyote or other predator damage." DeKalb County Auburn Extension Agent Chris O'Daniel also recounts the likelihood of predator animals removing circles of cowhide. "Predators are not bad about eating hide. They'll eat up the rest of it first. Along with the bones, the hide will be one of the last things to go." These statements made by expert professionals agree with the statements made earlier this year by the Fife PD that predators are not responsible for the mutilations. The conclusion, however, indicates a greater mystery. Who is doing this? And why is there a lack, for the most part, of physical evidence at the scene? Police Chief Junior Garmany and Mayor Graben, themselves involved in farming, believe the results of our investigation require further attention. It is incumbent on all us military, state, and federal government to assist farmers to find out who the phantom surgeons are. It seems basic to help the man who is responsible for ensuring there is food available for our dinner tables. The farmer is not interested in politically correct official explanations. He wants to know what has happened to his livestock. It should be the responsibility of all law enforcement to join together to find an answer to this problem that is adversely affecting the cattle farmer here in Alabama." Unquote. Initial theories by the investigating officers, as stated in the press release, were predator animals, scavengers, college kids, and even satanic cultists. Remember, this isn't long after the satanic panic of the 1980s. With their investigations, however, animals were ruled out, and they also somehow ruled out the college kids and cultists. The most prevalent theory amongst Alabamans is extraterrestrial causes. The Sand Mountain area has a disproportionately high prevalence of UFO sightings, with most documented sightings following the same typical format. A light in the sky that looks like an extra bright star, hovering for a moment and then shooting off into the night sky. The area residents noticed that there were more sightings than usual in the area during the time of the most active mutilations. There are so many UFO sightings on Sand Mountain that the town of Fife holds an annual UFO Days festival every summer. If you ask the federal government, of course, you'll receive a different answer. In the 1970s, a couple decades before the Alabama incidents took place, there was a lot of pressure put on the FBI to investigate cattle mutilations. This was largely headed by ranchers in Colorado, where the problem was even more severe and widespread. After all, most of our beef is raised out west. The FBI initially refused to intervene, stating it wasn't their jurisdiction. However, after the ranchers took it upon themselves to protect their animals and their investments, they began shooting at the black helicopters overhead. That's when the FBI decided that they needed to appease the ranchers with an investigation, stating Coloradans are gun happy and the FBI needed to alleviate their fears out of safety concerns. In the declassified documents I found, the FBI declares that their veterinarians have ruled that the supposed mutilations were in fact just caused by scavengers. They say that the cows had died of natural causes, and small animals, primarily foxes, come along and eat the softest tissues first. Hence the sex organs, rectal tissues, and udders often being missing. They blame foxes in particular as they have very sharp incisors that they state are scissor-like. They closed their investigation with this ruling. One of the more interesting theories regarding the mutilations is that it could be the work of the Wampus cat. The Wampus cat is an Appalachian cryptid said to roam the forest, stealing children and attacking animals at night. The history of the Wampus cat varies, but the most common story is that a Cherokee woman was extremely jealous and followed her husband through the forest at night, covering herself with a mountain lion pelt. According to folklore at this time, only the men of the Cherokee were allowed to witness their sacred rites. When the woman was caught watching, the medicine man of the tribe turned her into a Wampus cat as punishment, forever damning her to the life as a half cat, half woman. This bipedal cat woman is said to have glowing yellow eyes that can drive a person insane, and a screech that can carry a mile away. The legend of the Wampus cat does state that it kills animals, but I can't find any sources for the correlation between the absence of organs or blood and the Wampus cat. The most interesting theory for the mutilations comes directly from Ted Oliphant, the investigating officer for the mutilations. A few years later, in 1997, Ted submitted 2 articles to OurStrangePlanet.com, requesting they be posted as evidence of his theories for the incidents. The 1990s were a period of great concern over bovine spongiform encephalopathy, what we know as mad cow disease. Some countries were banning imported meats, and hundreds to thousands of head of cattle were being removed from the potential meat market out of fear of the disease. Mad cow disease causes an always fatal brain disease in humans called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, causing small holes in brain tissue, severe dementia, and neuromuscular disturbance. At the time, there was panic, because although they knew eating beef tainted with infected brain tissue could cause Creutzfeldt-Jakob or related diseases, officials weren't sure how else it was transmitted. There were fears over the national blood supplies and general food supplies. Now we understand that only infected neural tissue or objects contaminated from the tissue, like surgical instruments, are the only source of transmission proven so far. It didn't help at all that dead livestock used to be processed, cooked, and re-fed to other livestock, perpetuating the prion disease. Most frighteningly, the incubation period for Creutzfeldt-Jakob is 6 months to 40+ years. Oliphant believed that the U.S. government was using infrared technology in military helicopters to locate cattle that had a lower heat signature. When animals are very sick or dying, the blood is pulled away from the hide and extremities to the core of the body in effort to protect itself, so sick animals would have a lower heat signature. Once one of these animals was identified, Oliphant believes that a paralytic drug or something similar was administered to prevent a struggle from the animal, and the body parts removed for study. For instance, the rectum removed to study the digestive tract of potentially sick animals. The reproductive organs could be potentially used to determine how mad cow disease would spread from parent to calf. It has been asked why the government wouldn't just buy heads of livestock to raise. That would be way easier, right? But that isn't how science works, and it doesn't give us the accurate parameters for research. We need to see the sick cows alongside their healthy herd. The following is an excerpt from Oliphant's aforementioned article, this time specifically discussing the helicopters. Quote, "In 1993, I got a call from a man who told me that if I went to a certain place on a certain evening, I would see several helicopters land and refuel. He was right. Well after dark, 2 Chinook helicopters, that's the large twin rotor type, landed in the field behind some trees and carrying black plastic fuel bladders. Minutes later, several smaller scout helicopters landed nearby, shut down, and crews from the Chinooks walked over with large hoses and refueled each of a half-dozen helicopters. The whole operation took less than 30 minutes, and the Chinook helicopters took off and headed across the border, where we tracked them to their home base, Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Now, we know who they were, but we couldn't figure out why they refueled on Sand Mountain. The next morning, a reporter, Stephen Smith, from the Rainsville Weekly Post, called the public affairs officer, Captain William Gibbons, of the 101st Airborne, and asked if they might have been in our area the previous evening. "We have no aircraft in your area. It wasn't us," said the captain. It certainly was. So we knew then that some kind of secret operation was being conducted, but we didn't know what it was. We still don't. But when you look at each piece of evidence and try to use them as puzzle pieces, these so-called cattle mutilations might be associated with government studies of epidemiology. With bovine spongiform encephalopathy and Creutzfeldt-Jakob and many other diseases being so devastating, is it possible that many alleged cases of cattle mutilations are actually evidence of our tax dollars at work? When unmarked helicopters were witnessed by local farmers and law enforcement officers, Albertville Police Chief of Detectives Tommy Cole called in the FAA to investigate. Detective Cole had lost a cow to the phantom surgeons, and his wife had seen an unmarked helicopter over their pasture on January 8, 1993, the day before they discovered one of their Black Angus steers mutilated. An FAA investigator came to Albertville, and Cole took him for a ride in his police car. The FAA investigator was skeptical until an unmarked helicopter flew right over them. The FAA investigator couldn't believe his own eyes and pulled out a handheld radio and hailed the helicopter. The helicopter pilot didn't respond and ignored demands that he identify himself. This infuriated the FAA investigator, who had now reversed his skepticism. He was able to trace the helicopter to Maxwell Air Force Base in southern Alabama. When he launched an inquiry at the base, he was immediately told to drop it and never talk about it again. A week later, Chief Detective Cole received a call after midnight. It was the FAA investigator. It seems that while out in a boat on nearby Lake Guntersville, he and his family had witnessed a large triangle-shaped craft flying maneuvers above them. Unquote. Oliphant seems convinced of his theory of government investigation. It definitely seems more reputable than scavengers, aliens, or Wampus Cat to me. So now the question is, what do you think caused these mutilations? I wish I could say they ended after the press release, but rather they became more diffuse throughout the country. Livestock mutilations are well documented as early as the 1960s, although some state that they've been happening for centuries. And unfortunately, they continue today. As of the mid-1990s, the events had been recorded in 48 states, and although I couldn't confirm it, I have to think they're in every state now. This is a current nationwide problem, not folklore from the past. The most accurate counts I could find state that the number of livestock found mutilated is in the tens of thousands. So, what's your theory? That's the case of the Alabama livestock mutilations. Now, let's talk about it. Okay, y'all, so I had to do this story because the mutilations have always fascinated me. And if you're not familiar with these cases, they really have happened throughout the entire country. They're really prominent out west. If you want to start looking into this, that's a great place to start. But obviously, the Alabama ones were more topical for the podcast. I do know from just being interested in this for forever that in some places the cattle have holes in their neck, not to be cheesy, but vampire-esque holes in their neck. And I believe that those are usually blamed on chupacabras. Again, not an expert in the Western stuff, but it is particularly interesting. Another thing that's really interesting to me about this is that the meat was freaking cooked. That blows my mind. Because even if you use a cautery, that's, if you're not familiar, a high heat device that sears blood vessels closed, used in surgery or medical procedures, it doesn't cook the meat around it. It's just hot enough to just sear the vessels shut, kind of like a soldering iron. So it blows my mind that the meat was freaking cooked in these cases, and that's so fascinating. But it seems like the helicopters definitely are connected, because if they found these animals in the mud and there are never any tracks, then it has to be from the sky, right? The bit about the white powder evidence being found on that cow's side and on the ground, that's amazing that they could identify the material as being something that is not found in nature at all. It makes me wonder if that substance is how they obtain that high heat, maybe? Maybe combined with flame, that's how they're getting the cooked effect of the meat. But y'all, what kills me is that they put the material in a cigarette wrapper. That is just so funny. But I'm really hoping that that is what a farmer did when he found it, and not how the police gather their evidence. But if it is, I suppose I respect that they've remained consistent with that story since the 90s and admitted they just stuck in a cigarette wrapper. But I'm definitely not buying the fox explanation, mainly because, again, the meat was freaking cooked. But if it is foxes, then wouldn't most cattle deaths end up looking like this? Or wouldn't at some point someone would have seen an animal consuming the cow, right? Out of tens of thousands of cases, surely someone would have went to their pasture and went, oh, hey, look, a fox is over there eating that cow. And then these animals were seen like the day before most times. So farmers were aware that that cow had been fine earlier. It's not like it's been dead in a field for a week undiscovered. So I have to wonder if it is predatory animals, which I don't believe it is, but for the sake of argument, we'll say so. Does an animal drop dead and the scavengers immediately go to that site? I have a hard time thinking that's the way things happen. So I Googled it, which is not the weirdest thing I've ever Googled in my life, sadly enough. And it just makes my bizarre search history that much more interesting. But apparently it's really variable on temperature. So, obviously the hotter and more humid it is outside, the faster things start decomposing. This happened in the fall and winter in the South, so it shouldn't have been that fast, maybe? And out west where this happens a ton, it's drier, so maybe not then so much. Again, who am I to say? I can't stress how happy I was to find these articles by Ted Oliphant years later, that he is still speculating and theorizing on what happened. The fact that he wrote these and he was the investigating officer means that this could be no closer to the source. And if you haven't gathered by now, that is my favorite part of making these episodes, is researching and finding the same old thing, and then finding something this good. So admittedly, I trust his word the most. He is the one who was there for all of this. He sounds really reasonable, really rooted in logic. So I appreciate that. Even better than just the articles, Ted included his contact information in the articles. So I excitedly reached out, but Ted passed away in 2019 of heart problems. So that's really disappointing. I was really hoping to be able to talk to him myself about these cases and see what wisdom he could impart on us. So I have to say, if there are that many secretive helicopters at play here, it does make UFOs less likely, in my mind, and definitely does give credence to the government testing theory, whether it is about epidemiology like Ted thought, or about, I don't know what else they'd be testing for, but some other secretive thing, then it does seem more likely. As always, tell me what you think I want to know. I'm genuinely interested. Let me know on social media at obscureappalachia. Please subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss new episodes, because now these will be pretty regular, bi-weekly. And please rate the show on your podcast app to help others find me. Thanks so much. Until next time.